Welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to be looking at these lovely crocuses. We're going to be learning how to draw them and then paint them in watercolour. I'll be showing you step by step how to draw the crocuses freehand, how to choose a composition, and hopefully we'll end up with a painting that looks a little bit like this. So first things first, we're going to choose our composition. We've got our reference photo and we're going to put those two flowers into a nice composition. So I've got my sketchbook, done a few do's and don'ts. So try not to draw with strong hard lines and small flowers. We want nice light lines, big flowers, big shapes so that we can get lots of detail in there. So here's the composition that I've chosen. I've staggered one to the left and one to the right of the flowers, and I've added in some foliage. This just makes for a nice, interesting composition. It doesn't have to be really realistic, so that's what we're going to go with. So the easiest way to start drawing freehand is to look for the shapes that you can see in the object that you're trying to draw. So if we have a look at the crocus that's on the right hand side, if you look at the shape of the petals as one whole shape, it's like a triangle. So that's what I'm going to draw up here. So I've already picked where I want the stems of the flowers to go, and then there I've just drawn the triangle, and I looked at the shape for the second one as well on the left. It's more of an oval shape or more of a diamond shape. So that's what I'm putting in here. And that's just going to give us a nice guide to work on when we start to put in the shapes for the petals. So before we go any further, I'm just going to double check that I like the composition and the position of the flowers on the page. And actually, I'm not that happy with that one on the right. I think it's a little bit too high. So I've just erased that drawing, and I'm starting that triangle shape a little bit lower down the page. You have to think about these things, at the start of your drawing, because it's easy to rectify them. I'm going to add in just a few lines just to say where I want the foliage to go. So I put a couple on the right hand side, a couple at the back, and some on the left. Time to put in some of these petal shapes. Now I've just looked at this triangle shape on the right hand side, and actually if you look at the reference photo, the petal that's in the foreground actually starts about halfway up the flower. So that's what I've measured there. Just measured the point of that petal about halfway and followed that shape round, and then from there I'm going to measure the shape of the other petals and just follow suit. By following the shapes and breaking the picture down into different shapes, you'll get a better proportion on your drawing. And remember, you don't have to draw it perfect first time. We can draw the shape in, see where it sits on the page, and if you need to make a change to it, then you can do. Take some time now to finish the rest of the drawing and get it as accurate as you want. So once you're happy with the position of the petals, and make sure you do take out those initial shape lines that we put in. And when you're happy with it, just lightly go over the shape again, just so that the lines that you want there are more defined. And once you're happy with your drawing, if it's a little bit dark, just take an eraser and go over the whole thing. Don't want to get rid of it completely, but you do want to make it as light as possible because we don't really want to see it through our watercolour paint. The next step is to choose the colours that we're going to use for our painting. So I'll quickly explain what I've got here. This is a colour swatch. Now this is where I've taken each paint from my palette and I've painted a small square onto the paper that I normally use, which is the Arches paper. As you can see, side by side, the paints that are on the paper look very different to the ones that are in the palette. So doing this just helps distinguish what the colour is going to look like when it's on the paper, and it helps you choose the right colour for your painting. It's a really, really useful tool, and I do suggest that you make one. So there's a few colours I'm going to choose for this painting, firstly being the cadmium orange, and I'm also going to use some cadmium yellow as well, and that's for the stamen inside the flower. For the flowers petals themselves, I'm going to use Dioxizine purple. I think it's the best match on here, and when we layer it up it will go darker, so I'm going to stick to that cooler colour. And lastly, for the foliage, we're going to go with sap green, which is a nice light vibrant green, and then Hooker's dark green, just to add a little bit of depth in there. Start by mixing each of those colours that we just chose into the well. So you want a nice thick mix, not too watery, but we're not going straight from the pan. So try and get a nice amount in the well, ready for us to start the background. So I'm looking to create a nice softly blended background using the wet in wet technique. This means that the paint is going to blend nicely together with soft edges, but it's not going to mix. So I started by putting some clean fresh water down on the page. I am using quite a lot of water, but I've got quite a large area to cover there. I'm not putting the water onto the petals, and I'm only doing that right hand side of the page so I can work in sections. Knowing how much water to put down at the start is something you will have to practice, but you don't want puddles of water, you just want a nice satin sheen on the paper, and then it's ready to put the paint on. I'm applying the paint that we mixed earlier to the background now, so I am just going to take some of the yellow, place that onto the page. I'm not too worried about what the brush strokes look like at this point, because the wet in wet technique means that that paint will blend out and go nice and soft. So make sure you wash your brushes between each colour, you don't want any contamination. And I'm going to add some green now, basically putting in where the foliage is going to be. I've left spaces between the two colours at the moment, but with the next colour, the purple, I'm going to place it in between that yellow and green. But what I'm going to do is place it next to those colours, leaving a little bit of a white gap. And what's going to happen is, because that paper is still wet and the paint is still wet, the colours will meet eventually because of the water moving the paint on the page. But what they'll do is they'll just blend softly together, keeping the two colours separate, and they won't mix to make a brown colour that we don't want. So I'm just working my way around the rest of the page now, carrying on, doing the same, applying the water first and then applying the paint, placing each colour next to each other, not mixing them together on the page. So the finishing touches that I'm just going to put on the background are, we're just going to soften some of the edges, and I've just thrown a few spottles of water onto some of the areas that are still wet. That just creates some blooms and adds a little bit more interest. I've also just taken a clean damp brush and just tidied up some of the edges around the petals where the paint's gone over a bit too far. We want the background to be completely dry before we carry on doing anything else on this painting. I've left it to dry and you can see that the colours have blended really nicely. Look between the yellows and the purples. I have got a few areas where there was a little bit more water than I wanted. And what's happened is we've got a big bloom in the middle there. But I'm not too worried about it because it is in the background, and what I'll do is I'll be able to paint some foliage over it. If this was in the main part of your painting, you might want to do something about it, but for the purposes of this, if you've got anything that looked like that, we'll just leave it for now. Sometimes they can actually add character to the painting. Okay, so onto the petals. Make sure that you've refilled your wells with the paint mixes like we did earlier. And when you're ready, we'll start with the wet in wet technique. You can see here I've been quite accurate with where I've put that water down first. We want to paint individual petals at this stage, so we do want to be a little bit more refined and more accurate with what we're doing. So I've put the water down first, and then I've switched to a smaller brush so we've got a little bit more control, and I've taken that Dioxizine purple, starting to add it in at the top of the edges of the petal. Now that's because those parts of that petal, if you look at the reference photo, are darker. So when we first put the paintbrush down onto the page, we're going to put more paint, it's going to be darker. And then what we can do is, you can see I just clean the brush slightly and I'm just drawing that paint down onto the rest of the petal. So it's going to keep its nice light area towards the middle of the petal by just drawing the paint that we've already put down around in the shape of that petal. I'm just adding a little bit more of the purple to the very edges where it's darkest. So I'm actually taking it straight from the pan and just mixing a tiny bit of the water into it there. So I want it to be quite a thick mixture, and all I'm going to do is just darken the edges. I'm making it a thick mixture because I don't want it to travel very far on the wet paper. So just adding in the darker parts that I can see. There's a little bit of shadow towards the bottom of the petal, and also trying to put those sort of vein shapes in as well. So don't overdo it on this first layer. You can see it, I can actually still see the paper white. We will go over it again. Less is more. We want to work from light to dark. So I'm happy with how that petal looks. I'm going to leave it now and move on to a different part of the picture completely. If we were to start to do the petal next to it now, the painting that we've just done, the water would mix and would ruin the work that we've done. So move to another part of the painting. We're going to try and do one of the petals on the left hand side flower. So repeat the process, use the wet in wet technique, be accurate with where you put the water on the petal, and work your way around the painting. So I'm going to paint the petal at the back now, which also has the stamens on. So we're going to have to mix the yellow and orange and purple like we did in the background. So I'm again using the wet and wet technique, putting the water down first. Start by applying a really light layer of the purple, That petal at the back is quite a lot lighter than the one at the front, so we want to keep it nice and light. And then I've avoided putting the purple where the stamen areas are, so that when we put the yellow paint and the orange paint on, they're not going to mix too much. So you can see there I added the yellow first, and then I've just dropped in a very small amount of the orange. I'm doing the same for the flower on the left hand side. The yellow actually crosses over onto 3 of the petals at the back. So I'm doing a larger area with the water and putting in the light layer of purple again. And then I shall add the yellow and the orange for the stamens. Keep looking back at your reference photo, and I'm just going to work my way around the rest of the painting to get all of the petals to the same stage. Here you can see I've accurately painted that petal, and then I've added a little extra water that comes off the petal and goes onto the background. The reason I'm doing this is just so I can put a little bit more dark paint on and get a bit of a watercolour bloom and a bit of a softer edge on some of the areas of the petal. This is something that you can experiment with, you don't have to do, but I was experimenting with it here just to give it a bit more interest and a few sort of defined and undefined edges. Now that the petals are dry, we can move on to doing some of the foliage. So you can see in the wells there, I have mixed the sap green and the hooker's dark green. So we're painting wet onto dry paper. And so what I've done there is painting 2 of the leaves. And then I've done that in the sap green, and then I'm adding the hooker's dark green to it to add a little bit of variation in the colour and the shadow. You could just leave it like that, but what we're going to do is we're going to add some undefined edges to the defined edges that we've just put down. So while that paint is still wet, I've just taken the larger brush that we used earlier, and it's got clean water on, and all I've done is just touched the edges where I want the edges to be undefined, just touched them with the wet brush and added a bit of water. Some of them I've crossed over, some of them I've just added a little area. So you can see that paint already is starting to blend into that water. And what I'm going to do now is add some more painted areas to it just to accentuate those blooms. It is something that you can practice, but at the same time, it's not something that you can control really. Watercolour is uncontrollable when you're using a lot of water, but that is the point. So what we're after nice little blooms of watercolour paint, add areas of interest to the painting and give it a more painterly watercolour look. So I'm just working on this area while it's all still wet. I've added another leaf in, and I'm also going to add a little bit of Payne's grey to the hooker's green, and that's going to create some more shadows. So at the bottom here, I've really gone quite dark with the Payne's grey, and you can see that where I've left that Payne's grey, it's just blending nicely out with a soft edge into that water that we left there. So you can do as much or as little as you like of the undefined edges, but work your way around the rest of the painting to finish off the foliage. And then the last things to do will be to refine the petals. Moving on to the last part of the painting now, we're going to finish off the petals. So they need a little bit of adjustment and a little bit of refinement. So take another look at the reference photo. You can see that the edges of the petals are quite dark, so that's what we're going to try and do. We're going to try and refine those edges and put those darker bits in. So using a small brush, and we're not going to put any water down first, so we're working wet onto dry paper. I'm just going to go round the edge of that petal, and then straight away, before that has a chance to dry, I've washed the brush and I'm going with some clean water, and I'm just going to run that down the edge of where we've just painted. And what that's going to do is, instead of having a painted line all the way down the edge, it's going to soften that edge on one side. So I'll show you again. I'm painting that darker line on the outside and painting that all the way down the side of the petal where I can see it on the reference photo. And then what we're going to do is soften that inner edge before that paint dries. So painted the line, and I'm washing my brush, put it into the clean water, and then just work on that edge to soften it. You may need to do this a couple of times just to layer up to get the petal as dark as you want it to be. I've used the same technique to add in some of the veins that you can see on the petal as well. So there are actually two smaller petals on the inside of this flower, which I'm just going to use exactly the same technique to put in. So I've drawn the line, I've washed the brush, softened the edge, and that's just going to make that petal stand out from the one behind it. So we're going to keep repeating that process until we've finished the other flower as well. Once you're happy with the way the petals look, just have a look at your painting overall and see if it needs any finishing touches. So I've decided to put some more foliage in the middle. It will cover up that bloom that we had from doing the background, but also I thought it was sort of missing something there, so I'm just repeating what we were doing with the foliage before. We're working wet onto dry, put the sap green down and then the hooker's green, and then if you wanted to, add some extra areas of water to create those blooms again. After you've added the last of the foliage and any other finishing touches, you need to let it dry completely again. Then we need to rub out all of the pencil lines that we can still see. I don't think we can see many on here, but it's good just to go over the edges, just to tidy it up. And we come to the finale. So the last thing to do once your painting is completely dry, again this is optional, is to put the splatter on. I like to put the splatter on because I think it just adds another level to the painting. So you can see there I've mixed a really watery mix of the purple. I've taken quite a big brush. Bigger the brush, the bigger the Spottles you're going to get. And I'm holding the brush parallel to the painting and just tapping the paint loaded brush onto another brush. And what that does is it splatters the paint in sort of a controlled way. So I've done it with the purple, and I'm also going to do the yellow as well, just to add another layer. And there we are, we're all done. Make sure you let it dry again completely, but then we're finished. So I really hope you enjoyed painting this one along with me. There was lots of different techniques in there. I hope you learnt something from it. And actually I did this as a demonstration for my local art club. So I'm going to leave you now with some of the pictures of what the students came up with on the night. I think they did really well. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one.